Hi Year 10, Miss Adolphus here. I thought I would actually try something different this week and record our lessons, on over PowerPoint, just so that you can see kind of see as I'm going through, and you've got a little bit more visual there. Let me know what you think, if you prefer me talking to the camera or if you prefer the PowerPoint. Entirely up to you, but there's quite a lot to get through today. So we're learning about 3 different events today, and this was actually the height of the Cold War. So tension was increasing and increasing and increasing, and in 1962 we got the closest the world has ever been to a nuclear war. Hence the title is, Why Did the World Almost End in 1962? You might want to spend some time making some notes today. I have included space for you to do that, or if you've got an excellent memory and you just want to listen, that's okay. But the idea is that you'll watch this, you'll learn about the events, you'll make some notes, and then you'll have a go at the quiz so we can check that you've understood what you've learned about today. So if you want to write the title and the keywords, you can remember nothing stopping you from pausing me. So just pause the presentation or the video and write your title, write your keywords. Now, I've included here an actual source from the 1960s, which was a pamphlet or a leaflet given out to Americans saying survival in a nuclear attack. So have a think about, well, what does this suggest? What was America worried about in the 1960s and in the late 1950s? Obviously, they were really concerned that there was actually going to be a nuclear war, which is why the Cuban Missile Crisis is probably one of the most exciting events in the Cold War course that we do, because it was this moment where there was very nearly a nuclear war. Now, I've got 4 keywords here. I've included Cuba just to be absolutely sure that we know where Cuba is. So Cuba is a Caribbean country, and it had a communist revolution, and it is very close to the USA, which is obviously why the US were quite worried about it. They didn't want it to become communist, but it did. Now, a naval blockade, that comes up later, but a naval blockade means when ships are used to stop something getting to a country. When ships are used to stop something getting to a country. Missile bases are where missiles are kept. And nationalised means where businesses are owned by the state or the government rather than privately owned. So communism is really pro nationalising businesses. So making sure that businesses are owned by a country rather than by private businesses. Okay, just so that we're super clear, here is Cuba, just off the coast of Florida, round by the United States of America, so very close to them. And just so that you're aware, Turkey also comes up here as well. And I just wanted to show on a map where Turkey is in relation to Russia and the USSR, okay? So this comes up later in the story. So Turkey is incredibly close to Russia, or the USSR. Now, 3 leaders that you need to know about. We have mentioned 2 of these before, and hopefully you have heard of them. Now, Kennedy was the president of the USA in 1962. You may know Kennedy was famously assassinated in 1963, but 1962 he was president of the USA. Okay, you then got Khrushchev, who was the prime minister of the USSR after Stalin, or the premier of the USSR after Stalin. And Castro there with his cigar was the communist leader of Cuba. Now you might want to draw a little cartoon or take a moment just to make a quick note of those names, because they're going to be important for the stories that I'm about to tell you. Okay. Now, take a moment. The first event that we're going to learn about is the Cuban Revolution. Take a moment just to draw out this slide. You need probably a what and a so what. So leave 3 lines for what happened, and so what, or the impact, you just need 1 line. Okay, there's Castro again. So the Cuban Revolution was to overthrow their leader, Batista, in 1959. And he was replaced with Fidel Castro. Okay, so they had a leader in Cuba that they didn't like. They had a communist revolution, which meant they became a communist country led by Fidel Castro in 1959. So 3 years before the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. Now, the impact of this was that Cuba was close to the USA, and they didn't like having a communist country so close, number one, so they felt quite threatened by Cuba being this communist country. Cuba also nationalized businesses, which meant they were owned by the government, including USA-owned businesses. Okay, so the USA had some businesses in Cuba, but they were taken over by the Cuban government, which obviously angered them and increased tension. Cuba built closer links with the USSR as well. So as two communist countries, they became closer. The USSR was particularly keen on developing a relationship with Cuba because they were so close geographically to the USA. Okay, now there was a second incident called the Bay of Pigs. Okay, the Bay of Pigs was a name of an area in Cuba, as you can see on the map. So I'm just going to give you, maybe just pause the video so you can write what happened and then so what. So that's all about what was the impact. Okay, I ideally wanted this to come up one at a time, but anyway. So America obviously didn't like that there was a communist government in Cuba, so they wanted to overthrow them. So they came up with a sneaky little plan. They armed a group of Cuban exiles living in the USA. So these were Cubans that were probably that weren't communists. They supported capitalism and they were living in exile in the USA. Now the US government gave these group of men arms and weapons and sent them back into Cuba to try and overthrow Castro and the communists. So they sent them to the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, but Castro and Cuba were ready for the attack and 20,000 Cuban soldiers were waiting for them in the Bay of Pigs to stop the attack. Now, obviously, this made America look really weak. It was really embarrassing for Kennedy, one of the most embarrassing things that happened during his presidency. And also, when those exiles arrived, they were hoping that the Cuban people would support that rebellion and would join in. But actually they didn't. They wanted to stick with their new communist government, which again made communism look strong. It also meant that relations between the USSR and Cuba became closer. The USSR now had the excuse that, well, the USA are attacking Cuba or they're being aggressive towards Cuba. So we need to help them. We need to protect them as a communist country. And the USSR actually started storing some nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now, I'm going to put these links below, but it is definitely worth you either pausing and watching this or you watching it at the end. But if you Google Bay of Pigs 3-minute history, there's a really good video that just takes you through this Bay of Pigs event in 3 minutes to consolidate your knowledge. Now, our final event of today. So we've had the Cuban Revolution, which put a communist government in Cuba. We've had the Bay of Pigs incident, which was a bit of an embarrassment for America, made Cuba and the USSR even closer. And this all led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So for context, you're going to need about 3 lines: the events and the impact, or cause, event, consequence. Right. Pause it if you need some time to draw this out for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that Bay of Pigs incident led to the USSR putting missile bases in Cuba, as we know. The USSR and Cuba formed close ties and relations. And actually, it's worth knowing in terms of the causes of this event that the USA had missile bases in Turkey, which, if you remember from that first map, was incredibly close to the USSR and so quite a threat to them. And these missiles in Cuba were a threat to the USA. Now, the USA flew over Cuba because they were all spying on each other at this point and flying over the USSR, the USA, and the other communist countries and capitalist countries, spying on them and trying to work out what the other was doing. Now, it was a spy plane that spotted these missile bases in Cuba, and this obviously really angered the USA. So what Kennedy did is he put in place a naval blockade to stop the USSR delivering weapons, and they were delivering other things as well, other resources, to Cuba. Now, Khrushchev, that president or the premier of the USSR, the leader of the USSR, said that blockade was an act of war. And there was this really tense and terrible moment in history when people thought, oh my goodness, there's going to be a nuclear war. However, it's worth mentioning as well that they reached DEFCON 2, which is DEFCON 1 would mean there is a nuclear war. It was a scale in America that said if we go up this scale and we get to DEFCON 1, we are at a nuclear war. Now, for the first time and the only time in history, they went to DEFCON 2, which meant there was an imminent threat and it could happen at any time. People thought there was going to be a nuclear war and that the USSR and the USA were going to start hurling nuclear weapons at each other. However, Kennedy and Khrushchev realised that that would probably lead to their own mutually assured destruction. They would end up just destroying each other. And so they decided to agree on a trade-off, okay? And that brought the tension right back down. Kennedy said, I will lift my naval blockade, I will let the ships pass if Khrushchev agrees to remove his missile base in Cuba. And in secret, Kennedy also agreed to remove his base from Turkey, but the Americans didn't know that. So Kennedy came out of this looking like a real hero. I've got the USSR or the Russians, the communists, to remove their missile bases in Cuba. I've been successful. But the USSR got something out of it as well. They did also no longer have this threat of USA missile bases in Turkey. Okay, so it's like a swap. They agreed to swap, but some of it was done in secret. Now, this was the closest that we ever got to nuclear war. And the impact of this was that it led to a period of relaxation or détente. Okay, and you're going to hear about that word next week. We're going to do it in more detail. That's going to be next lesson. And it was a period where the tensions decreased. The USA and the USSR realised they needed to relax and they needed to no longer bring the world so close to a nuclear war. And there are a few things set up and treaties signed to try and ensure that that didn't happen. So the first one was that a special hotline was set up, so that's a telephone line, between Washington and Moscow, so that the White House in the USA in Washington, where the president lives, and the Kremlin in Moscow, where the leader of Russia lived, could speak directly if they needed to, okay? There was also a test ban treaty in August 1963, which meant no testing of nuclear weapons in space and the ocean. In 1967, there was the Outer Space Treaty, where they agreed they weren't going to fight a nuclear war in space. And in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty meant that they weren't going to spread nuclear weapons, or they agreed not to spread nuclear weapons to other countries. Now, these treaties didn't necessarily last, but they were a show that in the late 1960s and 1970s that tension was decreasing and that the Cold War was thawing, things were getting better. It didn't necessarily last, as you're going to find out, but this was the first kind of thawing of tensions. However, sadly, poor old Khrushchev was sacked because the Russian military felt like the USSR had looked weak in the whole dealing. And then we have the next USSR leader, who is Brezhnev, okay? And you'll learn about him next week. So we're going to, because we will do Prague Spring and then détente. So that's the end of the lesson today, guys. So you've done the Cuban Revolution, the Bay of Pigs incident, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are, as I said, I think here, Cuban Missile Crisis, Simple History. There are some more videos for you to watch, but I will link those in the description below this video, and I will also put those on Show My Homework. So I strongly suggest that you make some notes, that you understand all three events, that you watch this video a couple of times maybe, you watch the extra videos that I've put on for you, that you read the page on BBC Bite Size, and also I'm going to put up the Seneca learning. And I know this feels like a lot, but it will mean that without having your teacher there and without having us, to guide your learning in class, that you are definitely learning what happened, which is the most important thing. And then I will set a quiz on Show My Homework, which will be about 15 questions to check that you've understood what we've just discussed or what we've just learnt about. Please do email your teacher or me if you have any questions. It's jadolphus@saintahigh.org. Hope you all have a lovely week and hope you and your families are keeping well. Take care. Bye.